on the President's Council on Bioethics in 2004 and was named by CNN and Time magazine as one of the nation's 20 foremost physicians and scientists. He is a writer and author and has published 8 books so far. And if you haven't read one of his books yet, what are you waiting for? Carson has become well known for his speech at the 2013 National Prayer Breakfast, and he's been married to his wife Candy for 40 years, and they have 3 sons. Please help me welcome Dr. Ben Carson. I think he's coming. There he is.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And, I was thinking yesterday about the terrible tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the people who was killed is somebody I was talking to just a few weeks ago, the state senator, who, along with one of the other members, was a cousin of my business manager and close friend Armstrong Williams. And, these things hit so close to home. And if we don't pay close attention to the hatred and the division that's going on in our nation, this is just a harbinger of what we can expect. And I'd just like to take a moment of silence to remember those who lost their lives. Thank you. Well, faith and freedom, those are topics I like to talk about. There's no time clock up here, so you will see me checking my watch from time to time. I realized when I was out in Iowa, one of the left wing's media said, Carson kept checking his watch. That's because they gave me a very specific time and I didn't want to go over it. But they always find something negative to say. It's okay, I find them kind of amusing. But at any rate, when I think about the things that really enhanced my faith, I was a youngster who was troubled. I had a horrible temper. And I remember when I was 14, another youngster angered me, and I had a large camping knife, and I tried to stab him in the abdomen. And fortunately, under his clothing, he had on a large metal belt buckle, and the knife blade struck with such force it broke, and he fled in terror. But I was more terrified than he was, recognizing that I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. And I locked myself in the bathroom, and I started contemplating my life. I had turned things around academically. I was a horrible student, but through the efforts of my mother at making me read, I conquered that and become a very good student. But I realized I was never going to realize my dream of becoming a doctor with a temper like that. My choices were going to be jail, reform school, or the grave, and none of those appealed to me. And I fell on my knees and I just said, Lord, unless you help me, I'm not going to make it. And there was a Bible there, and I picked it up, and there were all these verses in the Bible about fools. And I read them. They sound like they were talking about me. But there were always all these verses also about anger, like Proverbs 19:19. No point getting an angry man out of trouble because he's just going to get right back into it. But encouraging verses like Proverbs 16:32, mightier is the man who can control his temper than the man who can conquer a city. Verse after verse, chapter after chapter, it seemed like they were all written about me. And I came to an understanding during that time that to lash out at somebody, to punch somebody in the face, was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. It meant you could be easily controlled, easily manipulated. I also came to understand that being angry has a lot to do with selfishness, because it's always about me, my, and I. Somebody's in my space, they took my thing. And if you can learn how to step out of the center of the equation and let it be about somebody else and look at things from other people's point of view, you're not likely to get angry. That was the last day I had an angry outburst. Has never happened again since that day. But you know, some people say, you just learn how to cover it up. No, I'll tell you a secret. When God fixes a problem, he doesn't just do a paint job. He fixes it from the inside. So it is fixed. Well, that gave me a lot of faith. I adopted God not only as my heavenly Father, but my earthly Father, to go to when you have problems and to help you in situations. I remember as I was entering my senior year in college, you know, I had been resisting relationships with girls, women, because I didn't want to get in the way of my studies. And I said, it's probably time to start here. So I said, Lord, let the next relationship be the right one, because I won't resist it. And he gave me the most wonderful wife, and in a couple of weeks we will celebrate our 40th anniversary. But you know, that's the way he's available if we just ask him for stuff in terms of our faith. And then, you know, when I was finishing my residency at Johns Hopkins, Johns Hopkins is sort of the modern birthplace for neurosurgery, and we were opening the new neuroscience center. So all the big wigs from around the world were there. One of the big wigs from Australia took a liking to me. He said, you should come to Australia and be our senior registrar at a major teaching hospital in Western Australia. And I said, Australia? You gotta be kidding me. I didn't say that out loud, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, you drill a hole from Washington and you come out in Australia and others, and I don't want to go there. Plus, you know, I had heard that they had a whites-only policy, so I wasn't all that interested. But it seemed like every time I turned around, there was somebody saying, good eye, Mike, how you going? And every time we turned the TV on, there was a special on about Australia. So I said to my wife, I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia. And so she went and started doing some research, discovered that they did have a whites-only policy, but it was officially abolished in 1968. So we sold all of our earthly belongings and off we went to Australia. And our friends were saying, you'll be back in 3 weeks. But little did they know we didn't have any more money. We couldn't come back. But, you know, the biggest problem we had was keeping up with all the dinner invitations. They love Americans, and they like to hear your accent, you know. The lady, when I would dictate an operative note, sometimes the ladies would call me up and say, Dr. Carson, we can't understand your accent. And I would say, excuse me, I'm the American, you have the accent. But you know, the second biggest problem, every time I sat down and start writing in a chart, invariably somebody would come up to me and say, can I feel your hair? And I would say, you can feel it, but it's going to cost you $10. But I always told the Aussies, I couldn't remember their names because they all looked alike. But, you know. But, you know, I realized why God sent me there, because there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I knew how to operate, as a senior registrar, they left me in charge of the major teaching hospital. So I was doing 3 or 4 major craniotomies every day. If I had stayed on at Hopkins as a low man on the totem pole, I would have gotten whatever anybody else didn't want to do. But I was doing these fabulous cases for a year. And when I came back to Hopkins and joined the faculty, shortly after that, the position opened up as director of pediatric neurosurgery. And normally they would get somebody with a lot of gray hair and a big name. But they said, you know, Carson's very young, but he knows how to do everything. So there I was at 33, chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. But the Lord had prepared me for that. And I began to understand how he always prepares you for what he wants to do. And I must say, I thought I was pretty hot stuff. And I mean, this little kid came in from Georgia, and he had been diagnosed with a malignant brainstem tumor, and multiple opinions. Everybody just told the parents to take him home and let him die. And they ended up at Hopkins, and I looked at the skin, and I just said, wow, this is awful looking. And the kid was barely moving, barely breathing, foaming at the mouth, eyes disconjugate, looking in different directions. And I said to the parents, there's nothing I can do about this. And they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son, and he's going to use you to do it. And I said, I'll tell you what, let's get an MRI. MRIs were new at that time. I said, maybe there's something the CAT scan's not showing us. We got an MRI. I showed it to all the radiologists. They said the same thing, malignant brainstem tumor. I told them, they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. I said, I'll tell you what, you've come all the way up here, I'll do a biopsy. 1 in 1,000 times the scans are wrong, and maybe this is that time. They said, oh, thank you, doctor. And I opened his head up, I went down to the brainstem, there was this ugly grayish red mass. I biopsied it, frozen section came back, high-grade glioma, a malignant tumor. I debulked it, took out as much as I dared, closed them up, went out and talked to the parents, said all the things you normally say. Only God knows why people only live for so long, and maybe he served his purpose already, and we'll understand it better by and by. And they said, thank you, doctor, but the Lord is going to heal our son. And, I just shook my head in amazement at their faith as I walked away, fully expecting that he would deteriorate and die. But instead, his eyes became conjugate, looking in the same direction. He started handling secretions. I said, what's going on? I said, maybe we should do another scan. And we did. And there was still a big, ugly tumor, but you could see a little ribbon of tissue way off in the corner. And I said, is it possible that maybe this tumor is outside of the brainstem and it's just crushed the brainstem to the point you can't see it? And maybe I should go back in? And they said, by all means. And I went back in, and the nature of the tumor was different. I peeled it away under the microscope layer by layer. When I got to the last layer, there was the glistening white brainstem, intact, smashed, but intact. And make a long story short, that boy eventually walked out of the hospital. Today, he is a minister. But interestingly enough, one of the oncologists came up to me. He said, I've always been an atheist, but now I'm a believer. But it was really for me, because I thought I was doing everything. I thought I was really hot stuff. And I realized after that it wasn't me, it was God. And I just said, Lord, you be the neurosurgeon, I'll be the hands. And that's where the title Gifted Hands came from. God is in charge. And it makes all the difference in the world in terms of what happens. And, I look at something like the Bender twins, the first set of conjoined twins. I've been involved in several, but that was the first set. And they were joined at the back of the head. Such twins had never before been separated and survived. Well, 2 months before I knew anything about the Bender twins, I just had this obsession with conjoined twins. And I started reading all the literature and trying to figure out why the results were so dismal. And I concluded that it was exsanguination or bleeding to death. And I started thinking about it. I started talking to people. I talked to a friend of mine who was the chief of cardiothoracic surgeons, said, you guys operate on little babies' hearts. How do you keep them from bleeding out? And he told me about hypothermic arrest, where you cool the body temperature until the heart stops, pump all the blood out, operate for up to an hour, warm the blood up, pump it back in, and start the heart up. And I was thinking, wow, that might work if we did it at the critical time. And 2 months later, here they showed up. They were being presented all over the world to see if anybody had an idea of how they could both be saved. And when I explained things, everybody started getting excited. We started putting together a team at Hopkins. And that was the great thing about being at Hopkins. You have incredibly smart people in lots of different areas. And you're able to put together the right kind of team. That is such an important factor. Because there were things that I didn't know, but there were experts who did know them. And if you can get those people all working together toward the same goal, it is amazing what could be accomplished. And in fact, as you know, it turned out well, and they both survived, and that was the first and only time that's ever happened with those kinds of twins. But God always prepares you for what he wants you to do, and that really is the key. And I think those of us who are people of faith have to trust in him, have to believe that he will give you what you need, and understand what you're doing. Know your stuff so well. Study to show yourself a workman who need not be ashamed, because you know what you're talking about all the time. I remember a few years back, I was engaged in a debate in Hollywood with a leading atheist. This guy thinks that anybody who believes in God is a total moron. And as we got to the end of the conversation, and he's denigrating anybody who could believe in creation, I said, you know what? You win. I said, because I believe I came from God, and you believe you came from a monkey, and you've convinced me you're right. But, I mean, what can I say, But the fact of the matter is, it is important for us to really have a good foundation in terms of what we believe. And we have to be willing to stand up strongly for it. You think about in the pre-revolutionary days in this country, those settlers, they were not happy with King George III and his dictatorial style. Tyranny was alive and well. And they began to get together in their town halls, their barns, their living rooms. They even invited the loyalists. They said, what kind of a nation do you want to have? What are you willing to stand up for? What are you willing to fight for? What are you willing to die for? And they encouraged each other. And that's how a ragtag bunch of militiamen was able to defeat the most powerful and professional army on the planet. That's what we're going to have to do today. We are going to have to be willing to stand up for what we believe in. The majority of Americans actually have common sense. They actually think logically. They actually believe in the values and principles that made this into a great nation. But they've been beaten into submission, and they're afraid to speak out. That's the reason that I stand so vehemently against political correctness. People fought and died so that we could have the freedom of speech and expression. We shouldn't give it away. It's the reason I am so vehemently opposed to this so-called Affordable Care Act. Not because it doesn't work, not because it's all about income redistribution and control, but the reason I dislike it so much is because I love America and what America stands for. And America is a place that is of, for, and by the people, with the government there to facilitate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What this demonstrates is just the opposite. The government comes along and says, I don't care what you, the people, think. We're doing it our way. We're jamming it down your throat. And if you don't like it, too bad. That is not America. We must stand up for what America really is. And it's going to really come down to this. Are we willing to be called a name? To get an IRS audit, to have somebody mess with your job or your children. See, most of us have had a tendency to just put our head down and hope that nobody notices. But I got to tell you, freedom is not free. You have to fight for freedom every single day. And it is not something that we're going to be able to pass on to our children if we neglect to do that. Think about the people who came before us. Nathan Hale started as a teenager, became a spy. When he was caught by the British and ready to be executed, he said, "My only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country." Think about that. Think about all the soldiers who gave their lives, many cases knowing that they would never see their loved ones or their homeland again. And they did it for you and for me. And now it's going to be up to us to decide, what are we going to do with that freedom? And yes, I know that President Obama said that we're not a Judeo-Christian nation. But he doesn't get to decide. We get to decide what kind of nation we are. Thank you so much.